Hi everybody, welcome back to Women in Literature, and in today's class I wanted to talk a little bit about our first paper as well as introduce the idea of persuasion. And as you can see from our notes above, that we've got our extra credit class discussions on Tuesdays and Thursdays from 12 to 12:30. Tuesday I held the first live chat. I think that went very well. Today we'll be doing Zoom from 12 to 12:30, and you can see in our Moodle course above there is a section there for accessing Zoom. In terms of the forum responses, some of you have been indicating that it's been challenging being able to respond within the 24-hour period because of your other commitments. So I'm going to give an extension on that and make it a 48-hour response time. So I hope that takes a little bit of the pressure off of you. In terms of your journals, and I know that many of you have already submitted in your first journal, I had made some mistakes with due dates. So basically, your first journal will be due on the 11th, which is today, at midnight via email, PDF, or Word. And then in terms of journal number 2, which will be based on persuasion, thought that could be due on Thursday on the 18th, also midnight via email, PDF, or Word. And then the papers as well would probably need some adjustment in terms of their due date. I was thinking that perhaps we could do something like having our first paper due on the 23rd. But again, the due dates are somewhat flexible. In terms of where we are, the papers are meant to be formal as opposed to the journals, which are one-page informal responses of thoughts or comments or questions. And that, as well as your form responses, hopefully will give you an opportunity to think about the text a little bit, as I've been giving you some general ideas to consider. And then what the paper will do is allow you to investigate one idea in depth in one of the texts. My thinking was that that paper would be approximately 4 to 5 pages long, but it is as long as it needs to be in order for you to be able to support a thesis well, which I'll talk about it in a few minutes. I thought that first paper would be basically on our first set of readings, which we started with The Story of an Hour, and then we moved forward to Frankenstein. Now we're beginning to discuss persuasion. Eventually we'll talk about Jane Eyre, but Jane Eyre kind of straddles both of the classes. So it's certainly an opportunity for you to write your first paper, but it's also an opportunity for you to write about in your second paper as well, just as long as you don't end up writing about the same text for both papers. And your second paper should be very similar to what you did with the first paper, except the second paper dealing with the latter set of readings that we would be discussing over the course of the semester. In terms of both the first paper and the second paper, these are critical papers. In other words, I'm not asking you to do any kind of outside research. That said, if you've got your heart set on doing a research paper, feel free to contact me and we can negotiate. The research paper is actually more challenging than writing a critical paper, because with a research paper, not only are you gathering what other individuals have said about a particular text, but you are also contributing your own ideas. And I know that some of the challenges with the research paper is that students will oftentimes just gather the information and not put any of their own commentary or thoughts into it. So a research paper is more than a summary of what other people have said. So it's actually a more challenging exercise. In terms of the critical paper, my thinking is that you would use your understanding of the text based on what we've done in class and any work that you've done on your own, so that you don't need to use outside resources. One of my goals is that by the ending of the semester, you could continue to read other texts in this time period that I have not assigned, and you would have an idea of how to go about interpreting those particular texts. That first paper can be rewritten for a higher grade. I kind of see it as a kind of draft paper, where basically you will submit it in to me, and then I will put commentary. I will evaluate for grammar and mechanics as well as for content, unlike the journals, which I just evaluate for content. And the journals, which I evaluate informally on a checkmark system, it would be a very different situation with the papers, in which I would evaluate on a letter system. and then I would return that to you. If you're content with your grade, you're done. But you can always take my comments into account, and if you need further direction, you can always make an appointment with me, and you can rewrite that first paper. And basically you get the higher of the two grades, which should be the revision grade. And you've got up until the ending of the semester to do that, but obviously the sooner in which you would do that, the better off everybody else would be. Because I see that first paper as kind of a learning exercise on how to write a paper. The second paper is due at the very ending of the semester, so you wouldn't necessarily have time to rewrite that second paper. That said, if you were able to get in that paper early enough and negotiate with me, there is a possibility you could rewrite it. Other students have done that. But my thinking is that the first paper is the learning exercise, which you can rewrite, and the second paper, you're just putting those skills into practice. And feel free to submit drafts along the way to me for feedback, and feel free to incorporate the information from your journals into your papers. In fact, that was one of the ideas I had behind the journals, is that you could use those to help inform some of your arguments for the papers. So, in terms of thinking about writing resources, you can see in the notes above, I've put down Purdue OWL. Some of you may be familiar with that site from Purdue University, but it's accessible publicly, where it offers a great review of how to go about writing a paper. And I've got that link there in the event that you needed to have some sort of a writing handbook, or if you don't have necessarily a good memory of some of the elements that you might have reviewed in previous classes about writing, then that's a good thing to review. Certainly, if you've got old writing handbooks from your Comp 1 days, you can review those as well. And in terms of what I did is that I've posted a handout that I normally would have distributed in class about my grading criteria, as well as a handout on how to write papers. And that's in our Moodle section on the syllabus and other documents folder. And it's also duplicated on the class announcements folder. Some of you indicated that you were having difficulty opening the attachments in the syllabus and other documents folder. So what I'm doing is putting the same information in text in the class announcements folder, so you wouldn't have to download it and you could read it in the event that you are having download issues. And as you can see also in the notes, I just briefly reviewed the criteria of how to write a paper. That your first paragraph basically is where you give your thesis. That's a position that can be debated. And basically your first paragraph is also where you give the name of the text and you give it the name of the author. And then your body paragraphs follow, and this is where you give your evidence, where you are paraphrasing and you are also giving quotation. In terms of quotation, a quotation should be exactly what somebody has said or what somebody has written, but you do have some opportunity to make some changes within a quote. For instance, if you were to use square brackets within a quote, that would indicate that anything in those square brackets is your insertion. It's not part of the original quote. And again, Purdue OWL talks about this as well. Basically, this is done in order to help clarify something within a quote. Not to give commentary about the quote, but oftentimes it's used for pronouns when it's unclear who the pronoun is referencing, because you remember that the pronoun takes the place of a noun. So you might want to use a square bracket, and then within that square bracket, give the name of the individual the pronoun is referencing. And you don't use a square bracket at the beginning or the ending of a quote. You get to basically decide when to begin and end the quote. You would use it somewhere between your start point and your stop point. And it's the same for the ellipsis, which happens to be 3 periods in a row. And basically this is for an omission. So if you were to delete something from a particular quote, something that just isn't relevant, then those 3 dots indicate that that's the area where you would have made that deletion. And again, you don't need to begin or end a quote with an ellipsis. It's only used between your start and your stop point. You can also have something called a block quote, which is where you indent the text of your quote if your quote is over 3 lines long. So then that makes it easier for the reader to be able to see the start point and the end point, especially the end point of that particular quote. And you do not need to use quotation marks with block quotes, because the assumption is if you are already indenting in your quote, well, then you don't need to use a quotation mark. That would be considered redundant. And again, I'm sort of approaching this as a kind of review, something that you've probably discussed in previous classes. But certainly, if this seems unclear to you, contact me and I can go through it in more depth. And certainly you can look this up in Purdue OWL as well. The conclusion of your paper is where you give a certain level of closure. And all of these paragraphs that you are writing in your paper should be a minimum of 3 sentences, hopefully a lot longer than that. The first sentence usually is known as the topic sentence, which serves as a kind of summary of what the paragraph is about. And in theory, if you've written a well-written paper, you can read the first sentences of your paragraphs and basically get an overview of what you were discussing in your paper, a kind of outline, if you will. When you think about the purpose of a sentence, as opposed to thinking about the purpose of a paragraph deals with one particular topic, so there are multiple sentences within that paragraph. A sentence deals with a complete thought, a complete idea. And punctuation, more often than not, just serves as a kind of cue as to how to read that particular sentence. So for instance, when to take a pause, that oftentimes is indicated by something like a comma. And again, you can look all of this up in Purdue OWL or any other writing handbook. And in terms of citation, or in other words, documenting where you're getting your quotation from, we are using, as all of the languages and humanities do, the MLA, or the Modern Language Association and system. And that means we're using in-text parenthetical documentation. And what that basically means is that at the ending of a quote, then in parentheses, following that quote, you've given the page number for that particular quote. And in terms of thinking about the criteria for essay evaluation, which I have posted, I've got indicated the distinction between an A paper, which is basically excellent, something that develops a clear central idea with originality and depth of thought, and a consistent sense of audience with clear and logical supporting ideas, with sound organization, with strong connections, with well put together and varied sentences. Generally speaking, when you're writing, you want to have a mix of long and short sentences. Not too many short sentences, that sounds kind of choppy. Not too many long sentences, that it can be kind of dense. You want to vary the beginnings of your sentences, especially if they are appearing next to one another, just so that you have some variety. And the A paper is also generally free of common errors in grammar, punctuation, and spelling. As opposed to a B paper, which is a good paper, it has a clearly stated central idea. It doesn't necessarily have the energy or the depth of thought of an A. It draws fairly safe conclusions, but the topic is interesting, focused adequately, logically developed. The organization is correct, but sometimes it strains a little bit, though paragraphs have central ideas. And again, organization and transitions can be an issue. Some of the transitions between paragraphs can be somewhat stretched or strained. And sentences generally have little variety in structure, but the paper is largely free of common errors in grammar, spelling, and punctuation. The C paper, satisfactory, has a reasonably clear central idea. It shows an adequate grasp of the reason for the assignment, but the focus can be blurred in some places. Development and illustrations can be sketchy in some places. Organization isn't always clear. Most paragraphs have a sense of organization, but development can be vague, and transitions can be awkward or even lacking. And now we're beginning to see patterns of mistakes in grammar and spelling and punctuation. The D paper, it doesn't state a central idea, though the pattern shows the writer has some central concept of what the assignment is. The sense of audience is inconsistent. Organization can be difficult to follow, and frequently the paragraphs seem to lack a central idea. Transitions are scanty or even absent. Sentences are awkward, incorrectly constructed. The writing doesn't indicate college level proficiency, and there are frequent errors now in grammar, punctuation, and spelling. And then lastly, the F paper. It doesn't really state a central idea. It doesn't really have a connection to a single topic. The writing is contradictory and characterized by many apparent changes of subject. There really is no evidence of overall editing or writing beyond the first draft. Most sentences have errors in their construction. Paragraphing is haphazard or even absent. And there are many errors in grammar, punctuation, and spelling. So just to give you a general idea of the distinction between the letter grades. But again, as I indicated, you can think of that first paper as a trial run if you'd like. So after I've evaluated it and I've returned it back to you, if you're content with your grade, well then you've completed that assignment. If you would like to rewrite it for a higher grade, you're certainly free to do so. And in terms of the handout that I've got listed about the critical paper, this actually was a handout that was distributed to me when I was an undergraduate many moons ago. And I have yet to find a handout that does as good of a job of sort of talking about the construction of writing a critical paper. And that handout that piece of writing is divided into 3 stages: the planning stage, the writing stage, and the presentation stage. And I can say that most students skip the planning stage and they try to go straight to the writing stage, and they make things much more complicated for themselves. So I really encourage you to spend some time thinking rather than writing, and trying to generate some ideas, and to list those ideas out in no particular order and not worry about grammar and mechanics. And then you can begin to formulate a thesis based on those ideas, a position upon which reasonable people could disagree. And then you can begin to construct sentences and paragraphs roughly. I mean, they'll need a good amount of editing probably, but that's usually a much more efficient way than trying to write what I call the perfect first sentence, which can often result in a huge waste of time and a large amount of frustration. And in the planning stage, you're told to analyze, not to summarize. The assumption is that you've read the book and the person reading your paper has also read the book. So basically, you are only retelling those pieces of the text that are necessary for you in order to be able to support your particular thesis. And the thesis should be, as it states here, comprehensive enough to be important, but not so general and bland as to be meaningless. And there's 2 examples here. The first is that in Hamlet, Shakespeare explores the complexities of experience. That wouldn't be a good thesis, because every single piece of literature on the face of the planet explores the complexities of experience. So you haven't really said much of anything. Another example is that Shakespeare employs much imagery in Hamlet. And that too is not a good thesis, because what's important is what imagery is employed and why, not the fact that imagery exists. And again, as I indicated with your paragraphs, each topic sentence should be founded upon an idea, not an event. That idea ought to support the thesis, and these topic sentences make up the skeleton of your paragraph. So you should be able to follow the progress of your analysis by looking at the beginning of each paragraph. Support each point in your argument with analysis, reference to the text, some direct quotation where appropriate, but don't let the evidence to take control of the paper. It's by definition supporting material. And generally, you don't end paragraphs with quotation marks or with quotations, because usually you want to comment on the relevance of that quote. Notice how I said generally. There are always exceptions. It's a question of knowing what makes sense in terms of the context of your particular piece of writing. You do need to support your point in your argument with analysis, reference to the text, and direct quotation where appropriate. And the reason why is because basically my job is to take the opposite side of whatever it is you are arguing. So if you wanted to say that Mrs. Mallard feels trapped within her marriage, I'll say no, she doesn't, even though obviously we've talked about how she was. So your job is to go through the paper and illustrate all of the ways that she feels trapped and why she's trapped and why the author would present that to us. And the conclusion is usually a place where people run out of steam, they're tired, they're frustrated. So basically save a little something extra for your conclusion. Don't just recopy your introduction and alter a few words. A little trick, I suppose, is that you can usually conclude your paper by relating your text to present day. That almost always works. You can also relate your text to another text by the same author. Writing, in terms of the writing, the first principle of good writing is economy and the second is simplicity. So basically, once you've written your paper, you should be able to go through your paper and ask yourself with each sentence, has this been stated as clearly as it can be and as concisely as it can be? Can you rephrase that statement to use fewer words? And generally speaking, if you can do so, you should. I know how sad that might be because now you're losing length in your paper, but much better to have a shorter paper that's well written than a longer paper that's not well written. And oftentimes that is what I'm doing in my commentary when I'm reading papers, is that I'm deleting language or I'm rephrasing sentences to state the same thing in fewer words so that it's more concise. Think about varying your sentences, as I had discussed earlier. Think about the idea that a paragraph is 3 or more sentences. Avoid cliches and trite expressions. This is overused language that doesn't really have any kind of originality. Dead as a doornail, tired as a dog, rating cats and dogs, things of that nature, to try to state it originally in your own language. And in terms of literature, maintain the present tense. And I know that seems counterintuitive. The idea that the literature was written in the past and you read it in the past. So chances are you want to talk about it in the past, but refer to it in the present. It wasn't that Mrs. Mallard thought, it's that Mrs. Mallard thinks. And then the very ending, the proofreading section. So the idea behind proofreading is that you've got enough time before the paper is due so that you can take a break and then revisit the paper, and you should be able to find errors or places where you can do some editing. If you have difficulty concentrating, one piece of advice is to read your paper backwards so that you can just look at the actual sentences themselves. Your paper should have a title, and that title should be original and should reflect your thesis. In other words, you don't want to call your paper Hamlet because if you are writing about Hamlet, because that title's already been taken by William Shakespeare, and he named his play Hamlet. So you want to do something original. You wouldn't want to necessarily call your paper Frankenstein, for instance, but you can use part of the title embedded within the text. Again, identify the work and author somewhere in the first paragraph. Generally speaking, we underline or italicize the titles of plays and novels and long poems. The titles of short stories and short poems are put in quotation marks. To give you an idea of how old this handout is, when you are going through it, it states, this is a quote, "Instructors prefer typewritten papers." We're obviously living in a world where it has to be a typewritten paper. Send it to me via email as a Word document or a PDF. It should include your name and my class. If we were handing in a formal paper, I would have you do a hard copy of a formal paper. I would have you do a title page. I'll leave it up to you as to whether or not you want to include a title page, which would include things like the title, your name, my name, and the due date. And the paper is due on the date assigned. So basically, if you need an extension, ask me and I'll be happy to grant you an extension. So that's a very quick overview about writing. So I hope I didn't go too quickly or too slowly. And in terms of thinking about our next reading, that happens to be the text Persuasion. So I'm hoping that you've begun that text and perhaps you've even finished it. But if you haven't finished it, hopefully you can finish it this upcoming weekend. And you can tell probably right from the very beginning of your reading that this is not a particularly easy text to read. What we're learning about is the world of British landed gentry. So these are individuals who have inherited wealth through property from generation after generation. What that has resulted in that they have received title as well as status, money, property, and they've got a whole lot of leisure on their hands because they don't need to work. We have this illustrated through the writing style of the text as well. We have these long classical sentences with very little action to illustrate the kind of world that the landed gentry live in. And we also learn a little bit about the importance of marriage in this world, that the idea is to maintain one's station with a good match or to improve one's title and station with a better match. So marriage is very much something that has a political function. It's less about romantic love. We also see a little bit about the differences between being a widower and a widow, with two characters we're introduced to at the very beginning of the text, Sir Walter and Lady Elliot. Sir Walter, his title is Sir. Lady Elliot, her title is Lady. Both of them are basically widows, but Sir Walter is perhaps likelier to remarry because he's a man, as we had talked about in the story of An Hour, and we talked about the role of marriage in the 1800s. Lady Elliot, less likely to remarry because she's got a certain amount of power and wealth and status. Part of the conflict in the novel is, will Sir Walter remarry, or I should say part of the fear in the novel is, will Sir Walter remarry, and what might that do to property, inheritance, and title of all of the other family members. Think about the title of this book as well, Persuasion, which means to gently influence. And you'll see the characters trying to do that with one another, but you'll also see the author trying to do that with us as well, the reader. And what we need to try to figure out, which we'll talk about next class, is what is it that the author is trying to persuade us of. In this text, unlike Frankenstein, we have a female protagonist. This is Anne Elliot. So that's one of the ways that this text is different from Frankenstein. And the text, as I indicated, can be rather challenging, in part because there are many characters and they tend to be related to one another and have connections with one another. My suggestion is that you keep a character list to show how they're all related to one another and how their connections play out over the course of the novel. As I indicated, next class I'm going to be talking more about persuasion, and today at 12 to 12:30 I'll have Zoom for anybody who wanted to meet and talk a little bit about either Frankenstein or the upcoming paper or the upcoming journal or persuasion. And I thought for today's attendance question, based on the reading that you've done so far, and I know that you may not have necessarily finished the book, but even if you're just in the opening chapters, what you're getting is a view of what it was like to live as a member of that landed gentry. So based on what you've read so far, would you want to be a member of this British landed gentry in Jane Austen's time? In other words, you wouldn't need to work. You would have a good amount of leisure, you would have title, and you would have status. And at least based on what you've read thus far, is that something that is appealing to you or not? Why or why not? So I hope to get some interesting conversation in our forum about that. As you can probably tell, I like to ask forum questions that don't necessarily have right or wrong answers, more about the discussion and the thought involved in the question. I think it is much more important than factual information. So I hope that generates some thought and some conversation. I hope you're well. I'm well. And next class we will talk about persuasion. Take care. Bye-bye.